Well, thank you so much, Penny, for sharing such a personal journey with Scott that you shared with us this evening. Although I have to say, I personally am never going to look at my terrier in quite the same way again. So this point in the evening of the annual dinner of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club offers a chance to linger a little upon Scott's involvement with the various cultural and historical organisations with which he had some involvement, and reflecting on those 114 dinners and those many toasts to various such societies, that gave me rise to think with quite some alarm about what an incredibly busy man Scott must have been. I found myself putting myself in Scott's shoes for a week. Perhaps this evening he'd be at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the next evening something perhaps a little bit more speculative, and then calls the charge of the 6 Foot High Club, and of course ending the week not with Netflix and chill, but rather with the Friday Club. Scott surely was the busiest of men, now to propose a national monument, then to find the crown jewels, and in between organise a citywide pageant for a king. He had to put it in a culinary context suitable for a room full of people who've just enjoyed their dinners, a finger in every pie. The contents of those pies, bear with me, seemed to seep gravy-like into his literary output, the one vitally informing and inflecting the other. Funnily enough, this pie analogy was not the turn of phrase that Andrew Lang chose in 1893. In his introduction to the Border edition of the Antiquary, Lang chose to express it thus, rather that Scott had entered literature through the ruined gateway of archaeology. Archaeology, as Lang would have understood it at the end of the 19th century, was used to describe a range of activities undertaken by scholars of antiquity, or antiquarians, those who took as their subject matter the material remnants of the past, art and artefacts, monuments and manuscripts, ballads and books, architecture and inscriptions. In claiming that Scott had entered literature through the ruined gateway of archaeology, Lang suggested that Scott's interaction with the material culture of the past vitally affected the tenor of his fictional writing. Antiquarianism, in Lang's reading, is the founding stone of Scott's entire literary corpus. And Scott was indeed born into an antiquarian moment in which there was a new focus on collecting and bringing together fragments of local and national past. Rather wonderful evidence of this is the fact that an organisation dedicated solely to this endeavour was born in Scotland only 9 years after Scott himself was born. Whilst the Society of Antiquaries of England had been formed some years earlier in 1725 from the rather less than promising beginnings of a meeting between 3 men at a pub, 1780 saw the formation of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, when David Stewart Erskine, 11th Earl of Buchan, together with several gentlemen of eminence and learning, formed a society dedicated to the study of antiquaries of our country, to discover and record, to produce knowledge, to foster learning, and to create a national collection of objects relating specifically, though not exclusively, to the illumination of Scottish history. Knowing as we do how avid an admirer, advocate and collector of Scottish history Scott was, it perhaps comes as no surprise that on the 13th of December 1796, at the age of 25, Scott was elected to membership of that society. Now, by the time Scott became a fellow, the Society of Antiquaries had accumulated a considerable body of objects illustrative and illuminative of Scotland's past. Yet, material magpie as Scott was, it's perhaps surprising to know that Scott's donations to the Society of Antiquaries Museum were few and far between. There were coins of various descriptions donated in 1822, and later that year, a chair, allegedly belonging to John Knox, which Scott described as ugly, and then generously noted that if its pedigree can be ascertained, perhaps the antiquaries would choose to have it. A possibly final offering was offered in 1827, and that was a heart, human apparently, stuck full of pins. It was found lying opposite the threshold of an old tenement in Dalkeith. A handful of coins, an ugly chair, and a grotesque and festering human body part hardly constitute a generous hoard from such a collector as Scott. But perhaps we should not judge Scott too harshly, perhaps because it's been 250 or so years since. What is apparent is that the work of the then Society and now Antiquarian Society of Scotland very much seems to align with Scott's interest, endeavours and outputs in his research, in his writing and in his house. And that might find expression in something that I found when I was perusing the website of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, which identifies themselves as a group of people with a common passion, and that passion is the past. Today, the Society achieves this amply through a lively programme of events, excursions, publications, projects, open access and heritage hubs, of which Scott, I would imagine, may be a keen admirer, perhaps a little bit jealous, and I think would probably sign up for membership once more if that were on offer to him today. And so I'd like to raise a toast to people, probably many of whom are in this room, people who love the past, and to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. To the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And so now I'd like to invite our very own Louise Gardiner, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, to give a reply to the toast. Thank you very much, Louise.
Right. It is a particular pleasure for me to respond to the toast offered to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland on an occasion like this, quite simply because the connection between Sir Walter Scott and the Antiquaries is so entirely obvious. Walter Scott himself was an antiquary through and through. He revelled in the investigation and discovery of things past. He was an avid collector of antiquarian objects, but of course his interests went much, much further. With his insatiable reading habits, he kept learning about the past and all its aspects, about the language, the poetry, the literature, the architecture, the heraldry, and the customs of the country during various periods of its history. And with his wonderful power of imagination, he then used all this accumulated knowledge to produce a continuous and almost unending stream of ballads, novels, and other writings. But he did not stop there. He also created Abbotsford, another antiquarian dream, of which every single detail which you might wish to look at will have a link to some historical object of particular relevance, which Walter Scott had come across at some stage during his life. And some of these objects had indeed been taken from other older buildings in the first place. However, Scott did not do all this in isolation. He was also exceedingly sociable and joined all manner of organizations and was deeply involved in all that was going on around him. And one of the organizations, as we have already heard, of which he became a fellow in 1796 at the age of 25, and no doubt with his usual enthusiasm, was the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The now so ancient and venerable society was then only 16 years old, difficult to imagine now, having been founded in 1780 and incorporated in 1783, very much a product of the Enlightenment and of the rapidly growing general interest in antiquities, both classical and closer to home. About 30 years later, Scott became its vice president for 3 years running, in 1827, 28 and 29, which would hint at a very close and enduring involvement indeed. And then, of course, there is The Antiquary, my favourite Waverley novel, and one of the earliest. In fact, it was only the third, which again shows that antiquarianism was never far from Scott's mind. However, it also shows Scott's lovely sense of humour in his portrayal of, naturally, an antiquary like himself, in the person of Jonathan Oldbucks of Monkbarns, who, just like Scott, loves to show off his antiquarian treasures to his guest, but sadly then gets stopped in his tracks when Eddie Ochiltree, a person of no real importance, points out to him, in the presence of his guest, that the foundation of the Roman Praetorium, of the discovery of which Oldbucks is so very proud, are, in fact, merely the remains of a wall which Eddie Ochiltree himself had helped to build about 20 years before. This story almost makes one wonder whether Scott himself had perhaps once found himself in a similarly embarrassing position. But one thing seems to be quite certain, that Sir Walter Scott was a very keen antiquarian and, no doubt, an enthusiastic fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. So, thank you so much on behalf of the Society.
Actually, could I just say that just a couple of days ago, I'll say to my surprise, the King reaffirmed that he would be the patron of the Antiquaries. So yet again, they have a royal patron.
Well, thank you ever so much, Ian, for that news hot off the press, and Louise for that wonderful reply from the Antiquaries. So I'd like to invite Michael Wood to give the vote of thanks from the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club.
Lovely. Well, I was recently informed by a long-term member of this club and a good friend that the best votes of thanks should ideally be almost as long, if not as long, as the talking questions. So best get a refill, because you're in for a long one. I've already missed my train, so I'm here till at least past. Don't worry, I won't. But first of all, thank you very much to Penny for an absolutely wonderful talk this evening, and one that I think has really touched on a real reason why so many of us are here this evening, that question of a personal connection to Scott, to his novels, to the world that he addresses, the world that he creates. One quite a sort of flippant, but for me quite important starting point. As a native of Edinburgh, I always was aware that I should at some point try to read Scott, whom my father had described as boring. He was from Motherwell, so he wouldn't have got it. And one day I started seeing this rather lovely lass who was doing a PhD on Scott, so I thought I'd impress her by reading Waverley, and it seems to have paid off. But no, the way we encounter Scott is so important. Personally, we now live in the Borders, which is so alive with that history and those stories. And from our very window, we see the Eildons, cleft in two by Michael Scott, and thanks to Scott for telling us about that. And of course, we Melrose Abbey right in front of us, and we basically live in Kenilworth. But aside from that, there's something that I think Ian brought us a couple of years ago at our first and only ever virtual annual dinner, which was this question of meeting a person who brings us in a time of polarity, in a time of sheer shocking difference, brings us the question of how do we navigate those differences? How do we find the in-between? How do we find where we put ourselves between those? And that's something that Scott really speaks to in these times and remains with me as I continue to read Scott, which I do. and think about Scott in these days. So that's the end of what I was going to say, aside from to thank Penny for her talk, to thank Louise for her reply to the toast, to thank Lucy for chairing such an excellent evening, which she's put together with David and Lee, who also deserve our heartfelt thanks for a stunning evening. And thank you to everyone else. So, there's the vote of thanks. Cheerio.